RTI
International's
Justice
Practice Area
presents
Just Science.
Welcome to Just Science, a podcast for justice professionals and anyone interested in learning more about public health, innovative technology, current research, and actionable strategies to improve the criminal justice system. In this special release episode, Just Science sat down with Brey, criminal justice researcher and PhD student at Temple University, and Harrod Emmanuel Clay Jr., pastor and community-based advocate, to discuss findings from RTI's Victim and Witness Participation Research Project, which is supported by the philanthropy Arnold Ventures. For individuals who have experienced or witnessed severe community violence, there's often hesitation to report the crime, participate in law enforcement interviews, or engage in court proceedings. To better understand these barriers, community violence researchers at RTI International and Temple University conducted interviews with individuals who had recently experienced incidents of severe community violence and found that fear of retaliation, concerns about social consequences, and poor communication from law enforcement are among the most significant obstacles to victim and witness engagement in the criminal legal system. Listen along as Jesse and Pastor Clay describe the importance of giving victims and witnesses a voice after violent crime, common themes found across the research interviews, and important considerations for improving the legal system's response to victim and witness participation. This episode is funded by RTI International's Justice Practice Area. Some content in this podcast may be considered sensitive and may evoke emotional responses or may not be appropriate for younger audiences. Here's your host, Stacy Sechrist.
Hello, and welcome to Just Science. I'm your host, Dr. Stacy Sechrist, with the Victim and Witness Intimidation Project, funded by the philanthropy organization Arnold Ventures. On today's episode, we will discuss why many victims and witnesses of severe community violence choose not to engage with the criminal legal system, and how criminal legal experts can support these individuals while they seek justice for themselves or their loved ones. When we refer to severe community violence, we mean acts such as shootings, robberies, murders, and severe physical assaults, and these typically occur outside the home and that are not domestic in nature. Here to guide us in this discussion is Brey from Temple University and Pastor Harrod Emmanuel Clay Jr. from Philadelphia. Welcome, Jesse and Pastor Clay. Thank you for talking with us today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for having us.
Pastor Clay, let's start with you. How did you start working with victims and witnesses of violent crime, and what kinds of support do you provide?
My journey in this work began as a pastor with two parishioners who both had loved ones who were victims of gun violence, one fatally, one non-fatally. Also around that time, my childhood best friend sadly was also a victim of gun violence, and his incident, unfortunately, was fatal. In terms of the services that I provide, it's everything from trauma-informed counseling. There's an opportunity, unfortunately, in cases where the victim is fatal, to provide funeral support, supporting the family in terms of their interaction with law enforcement. Many times, these families have not had any encounter with the criminal justice system, and they're completely unaware of how it functions. So that's a few of the services and supports that I provide.
Thank you, Pastor Clay. It sounds like your work is extremely personal to you and certainly motivated you to continue to be involved. Jesse, what kind of work are you doing at Temple University?
Yeah, thanks, Stacy, and thanks, Pastor Clay. Just wanted to shout out him again for being on this project with us. He's been such an enormous help. But in addition to the work that we're talking about today, I'm also currently working on my dissertation, examining how a loved one, a family member being incarcerated impacts the family system. So how everybody in that family is impacted by having a loved one incarcerated. And in addition to that, doing some work on some violence intervention programs, as well as doing some research examining policy implementation at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office.
Thank you, Jesse. So briefly, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Stacy Sechrist, a researcher with RTI International's Justice Practice Area. RTI is a nonprofit research organization, and we're based in North Carolina, but we work with communities across the country in our research projects. We strive to share and disseminate information to the field about what we've learned and develop recommendations to affect change and improve practices. So the project that we're going to talk about today, as mentioned earlier, is the Victim and Witness Intimidation Research Project, which was funded by Arnold Ventures. And the goal of that project is to understand the barriers to victim and witness participation in the criminal legal process following experiences with severe community violence. So when we say participation in the process, that can include things like reporting incidents to police, talking with police as part of investigations, all the way through to participating in court and legal proceedings, such as testifying at trial. As part of this project, we have held focus groups with professionals who are working with victims and witnesses of severe community violence. Professionals that we have included in those focus groups are investigators from local law enforcement agencies, prosecutors at the state and federal levels, victim and witness assistance or support staff within law enforcement agencies or prosecutors' offices, or victim service providers within community-based organizations. And we've also talked with leaders of community-based organizations who work with individuals who have experienced community violence. Additionally, we have conducted 60 individual interviews with people who have witnessed or experienced recent community violence to better understand those experiences. The focus groups and the interviews have taken place in Philadelphia, which Jesse led, and in the Triad region of North Carolina, consisting of Greensboro, High Point, and Winston-Salem, which I led. So Jesse and Pastor Clay, you all have been conducting interviews with both victims and witnesses, as well as criminal legal professionals in the Philadelphia area. So Jesse, let's start with you. Would you speak to some of the findings from the interviews in Philadelphia?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's obviously a lot that came up, where we've done 40 interviews in Philadelphia. But I think there are really two issues that were most salient that really came up frequently across, almost every single one of the interviews that we did. So the first is related to the community aspect, witness intimidation, that sort of thing. And that many of the people we spoke with had a really genuine fear that if they cooperated with law enforcement, that there could be or will be repercussions for that. And so these could be repercussions, as serious as somebody trying to kill you. It could be somebody just, physically attacking you. People felt that their family and friends might be in risk, right? In certain situations, if it's serious enough, we heard people say like they'll come for anybody. It could be, friends, family, anything like that. But there's also, especially for some of the street-involved individuals we spoke with, or street adjacent. So they're not really involved, but maybe they're connected with some people who are involved in the street. They also had this really palpable fear of what I've been referring to as like a social death. So even though there's not physical repercussions that come from it, they might lose their entire social network of friends, peers, kind of be shunned as this untrustworthy outcast. But the other really important issue is one that, we heard from almost every single person that we spoke with, and that is the issue with law enforcement themselves. These individuals also had really negative treatment by police in their role as victims and witnesses. So, they might have been treated as somebody who did something wrong, even though they were the victim, not really given much respect. They talk about how police spoke with them really disrespectfully. Some individuals even faced criminal justice repercussions, so like revocation of their community supervision, or fear of, going to police as a victim or witness and having, warrants that would lead to them being reincarcerated. So I think those are the two biggest issues that we saw throughout our interviews.
And just joining with the observations and sort of the summary results of our interviews, I would just add it was really a beneficial experience for me in observing how Jesse asked questions. We tended to see in almost all of those interviews that there was the concern about retaliation. There was what Jesse refers to as that kind of social death, and then the negative experiences with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement, with probation, as Jesse just mentioned. And it's a lose-lose scenario. And I think the advantage of this study, this research project, is how do we get to a win-win-win-win scenario with the involvement of victims and their participation in the criminal justice system. So from start to finish, if we were interviewing an individual who had been shot, the initial interaction with detectives at the emergency room tended to be a lose scenario. There was often a lack of follow-up. They would not hear from the detectives ever again. When they engaged with the detectives in the emergency room, the detectives tended to see them more as the criminal, even though they were the victim. And so they felt overall not a sense where the detectives were trying to support them in getting some resolution. We rarely saw resolution. We rarely saw follow up. And the biggest thing that I heard from the interviews was a sense of distrust, that they could not trust law enforcement and in the community if it was discovered that they were cooperating. As Jesse pointed out, that could be a fatal result or more of the social death result where they were ostracized in the community.
Thanks for that. And a lot of those findings were very similar to what we saw in North Carolina as well. Jesse, I did want to bring up one point that you had shared in a prior discussion, and you talked about the impact of negative prior experiences, which could be direct for a victim or witness or could be vicarious, meaning that a victim or a witness could have seen a negative interaction or experience by someone else in their community, and that can affect their willingness to participate. I wanted to see if you wanted to share or expand a little bit more on that point that you brought up last time we talked.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. I think it's a really important point to talk about that, many of the individuals we spoke with had both their own negative experiences with police and, this kind of cuts across the different subpopulations that we spoke with. So we had certain number of mostly young Black men who had been victims of gun violence. We also had a subpopulation of mainly mothers who lost children to gun violence. And then we had another sort of subpopulation of women who were mostly in recovery from substance use. A lot of them were living down in the Kensington neighborhood, had spent time unhoused. And across all these different groups, they had usually their own experiences of, harassment by police or times where police mistreated them, even for, the moms who had lost children to gun violence, sharing experiences where detectives were very cold, where they were very standoffish, upset with these moms when they would be calling in to try to find out information about their cases or even relay information to the detectives about possible leads. And then the women that we spoke with who were in recovery spoke about how, they might have had prior victimizations where they were blamed for the victimization because of their drug use or because of their status as an unhoused person, right? That, even for things as egregious as sexual assaults, the police kind of giving this, well, what did you do? And, that the same goes for the young men, who survived gunshot wounds. It was often this sentiment from police of, well, what did you do? What are you involved with that you got shot? And that's just on the focal incident that we were talking with them about. And in addition to that, they all shared, these long histories of negative treatment by police. And like you mentioned, it also doesn't always need to be personal, right? I mean, these kind of stories take on a life of their own, become like a word of mouth situation where you talk amongst other people in the community about things that have happened to you, and it kind of creates this sense across the whole community that you just can't trust law enforcement, that they're not really there to look out for you.
I wanted to share some of the context that victims and witnesses brought into their interviews that we conducted in North Carolina to see if there were similarities with what you all saw in Philadelphia. So in North Carolina, we saw that across the participants who we spoke with, most of them had multiple experiences with community violence that they were able to speak with us about. So some people talked us through, as many as 3 different incidents that they had experienced. And most stated that, they had multiple incidents, more than that they had experienced across their lifetime. But for purposes of the interview, of course, we had them to focus in on those most recent incidents to speak with us. Also, most of the victims and witnesses had experienced the violence very recently within the last 1 to 2 years. So our victims and witnesses were really bringing in this layered history with either witnessing or experiencing violence. And so it has really been a part of their life up to the point that they came into the interview. And so they had a lot of different layered nuances that they were able to share with us. It was also interesting that many participants mentioned during the interview or shortly thereafter that they had never spoken about the incident before to anyone. Also, several of the incidents in North Carolina were never even reported or known to law enforcement. So it was very interesting to hear participants talk about how going through the interview process itself was somehow cathartic and that it allowed them to sort of release a burden that they had been carrying around because they'd never had the opportunity to speak about these incidents, oftentimes because they didn't want to be known as victims or witnesses, or because it's just sort of a taboo topic to talk about within their own social networks. So that was very interesting. And then in general, we heard from victims and witnesses about a need for more victim and witness support. So most of the victims and witnesses that we interviewed who had actually spoken to law enforcement about the incident were never actually offered any assistance or resources to help them navigate through the process or any follow-up support to help them in the aftermath. And then, as Pastor Clay said, also in North Carolina, we heard that many victims and witnesses never received any follow-up whatsoever from law enforcement. So after that initial report, or sometimes a set of initial questioning with law enforcement, they never even heard, was someone arrested? What was the resolution to this case? And again, these are very traumatic incidents, sometimes involving injury, gunshots, possible death, and people really have no closure or follow-up whatsoever. So I wanted to toss it back to you all to see if you heard similar kinds of trends in the Philadelphia area.
Pastor Clay, do you want to take this one? I feel like, as most of the people we spoke with, when we'd ask if they had any services or resources, they'd point to Pastor Clay and say he's the resource. So I'll let him take this one.
You're on point, Stacy, in terms of what we see in your efforts there in North Carolina and what we saw in Philadelphia. And it's concerning, and yet it is a huge opportunity. When we consider on the back end, we desperately need the victimizer to experience the criminal justice system. In some cases, those victimizers may need to be removed so that they can be rehabilitated. But if on the front end, the experience of the victim is a negative one, and we don't get to a arrest and what we talk about in terms of the clearance rate and whether or not there's, a preliminary hearing, let alone a trial. And in between, we have a community that doesn't feel safe. And you often will hear law enforcement express a certain sense of frustration that they can't get the victim to come and testify. And so if we're looking at the number of encounters the victims have had, as you pointed out, Stacy, that there are multiple incidents, that they're recent incidents, and the reality that victims we interviewed felt cathartic. There was almost what we heard was this was therapeutic. Then we may have in front of us a huge opportunity to maybe help law enforcement, help the criminal justice system with this research project. And what we've discovered, where, as Jesse points out, the victims felt like with my interaction with them, that was pretty much the only support they had received. So if Jesse and I and you, Stacy, could experience the kind of interaction, we had victims who, at the end of the interviews, Jesse will recall, were saying, I didn't anticipate going into that amount of detail, the level of detail. And what I found was Jesse's ability to get in their shoes, to ask the question in a way where they didn't feel like they were being attacked or being re-traumatized, but where Jesse demonstrated a real concern, had them really giving us valuable feedback. And I think the lessons that we learned are big. One of the things we haven't mentioned, if we're going to see victims participate, is the opportunity to relocate them. And it's a huge, huge, huge need. I think if we can do better in relocating the victims after their incident where they've been shot, and then when it's time for them to testify, because they've had a more favorable experience with law enforcement, then we may be able to relocate them. And let's say we now have the arrest, we now have the prosecution of the victimizer. And now, maybe in a year or two, we might be able to work with the victim so that they feel like they could return to the area or the vicinity of the area. And so, one of the important services that I provide where we can get cooperation with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement, and with the victim is the opportunity to relocate them.
Well, first, Pastor, thank you for the kind words about the interviewing. I really appreciate that. But also, I think, something that the pastor and I have spoken about, and, I think, one of the things that he's kind of getting at here as well is we need to be able to give people a sense of safety in their communities. And right now, at least with many of the people we spoke with, there was a complete lack of that. Like people just simply don't feel safe when they're in their communities. And, that leads to a lot of the violence that we see, especially retaliatory violence. I mean, we talked to a lot of individuals who carried guns and they shared with us like I've been seeing violence, I've been seeing shootings my whole life. I've been shot, I've seen friends killed, I've seen family killed. I carry this gun because I feel like I need to, right? And so the question is, how can we as a society, as a community, as different institutions, how can we start to make it so that individuals are feeling safe, so they don't feel like they have to carry a gun? So they have places that they can go to that are safe, they have people that they can go to, like Pastor Clay, or like these other community organizations that we've worked with in the scope of this project to really make these individuals feel that safety, and then we can start to really push the envelope further. And I think to Pastor Clay's point about relocation, that's kind of at the heart of that. We had individuals we spoke with who said, after I was shot or after XYZ happened, I went to stay with a family member in Atlanta or Jersey or, wherever. And they say like, man, I really, I really loved that. Like I didn't have to look over my shoulder while I was there. I, just felt like I could walk around and feel safe. And that's just such an important piece that we need to work on. And also, just being able to talk about this experience, talk about their experiences with violence is such a great step for starting to feel that way.
Those are great points. And one thing that I found particularly interesting, at least in North Carolina, is this fear of retaliation is very, very salient to victims and witnesses. And also, they said that there's not really much witness protection available to us. And when they talked about relocation, one, it was often a resource that they seem to think is unavailable to them. But two, it's also not without its own challenges. So, in order for them to relocate, they're acknowledging that they would need to basically uproot their entire life, possibly leave friends and family, leave a job, and go live somewhere else that's, without their existing support systems after they have just experienced or witnessed a very traumatic event. So the challenges with relocation, even though it's ideal, and many victims and witnesses talked about how important it was, they also added, but we also acknowledge that it's hard and it's not without its challenges. And then another piece that I thought was interesting from the criminal justice professional side was almost this tendency to downplay the reality or actuality that an act of intimidation would be followed through upon. So, this fear or these threats are one thing, and they're very real to victims and witnesses. But in speaking with, prosecutors and law enforcement personnel, they tended to downplay that actually carrying out these threats would come to fruition or become a reality, which to me was very surprising because we have this misalignment between this fear, which we know is really driving the decision making and the lack of participation for victims and witnesses, and this lack of acknowledgement from the criminal justice system that they really need to act to do something to address those fears or concerns. So I found that misalignment to be concerning, but I wanted to see if you all found that to be similar in your conversations with criminal justice professionals there in Philadelphia.
Absolutely. It's almost frightening when you consider the misalignment that you referenced, Stacy, where the victim has, and in many cases, a verifiable threat. Sadly, with social media, we have individuals, victimizers, who will engage in a shooting and then brag about it, take credit for it. And when we present it to law enforcement, sometimes there's a real reticence to act and to act swiftly. And we combine that with sort of the challenges with relocation. And when we look at the whole process there, it is fraught with challenges. And yet, my interaction with individuals who've been victimized is what they'll tell me is, hey, I came within inches of losing my life. So someone tried to kill me. We can acknowledge that reality. And so I'm sort of looking to law enforcement, to the criminal justice system, to help me have a feeling of safety. And if that misalignment is real, then we're back to the lose, 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 lose reality. I hear the frustration. I hear the heart of law enforcement, especially detectives, where they indicate my caseload is astronomical. Pastor, I know you need me to follow up, but Pastor, I'm going to get a new case today. I'm going to get 2 new cases today. And what happens is what I see in courtrooms and in conversations with detectives is that often they're jaded. Sometimes they're just overwhelmed. And so that often is communicated to the victim. And the misalignment that you referenced, Stacy, just compounds the inevitability of this not being a good outcome. And I'll just add that where we have seen real success, it's very interesting that I'm able to get the victim and the detective in the same room and sort of do what we're doing now, have a conversation.
Thanks for that, Pastor Clay. And I think you're leading us the direction that we wanted to kind of conclude our session with, which is what can we do moving forward to better support victims and witnesses? And it was interesting that victims and witnesses were so acutely aware of what it means to, quote unquote, be on paper, and their fear of being found out by a defendant through the process of discovery. And so, people's kind of keen awareness of that process and not wanting to show up on paperwork was something that was often mentioned. Do you have any thoughts for how to better help victims and witnesses and perhaps criminal justice system actors navigate through that challenge or concern? Because it could be possible that a defendant would know who the victims and witnesses are against them once they see their discovery evidence.
Yes, Stacy. So I can say that that's definitely something that we heard a number of times about this idea of ending up on paperwork. And that directly ties in with the social media piece because, somehow individuals are obtaining photographs of this paperwork and then they're uploading it to social media. So not only do the individuals that are directly involved with the court case know who's cooperating with law enforcement, but now everybody that's in a community can find out who is cooperating with what. So that's a really big issue. And Pastor Clay and I actually had an instance where we were doing an interview with a person and they talked about this fear of ending up on paperwork, and while the 3 of us were sitting there, went onto their phone and pulled up a screenshot from social media of somebody's paperwork where they were showing who was cooperating with law enforcement. So, right there in real time showed us why that fear is so salient for them. As far as what to do about that, I think that's a really difficult question. How can you make sure that due process is happening and that people are having a fair shot in court while also trying to protect victims and witnesses? That's a really difficult question. I'm not sure if I have the answers for that. Certainly, I think we know that pictures of these things, if they're getting out, that's probably getting out from somewhere on the inside of the process, right? And, not to point fingers, we don't know how that happens, but maybe there could just be rules in, how you're seeing this paperwork, and, maybe you can only view it in certain places without phones present or something like that, right? At least put in some sort of protections where whoever is being accused has their right to challenge their accuser and challenge that evidence in court, but also try to do some things to at least make sure it's not being photographed and sent around on social media.
The worst case scenario is one that I witnessed where we actually got to the preliminary hearing. We had the witness who took the stand, and sadly, someone was in the gallery recording the testimony of the victim, uploading it to social media. I think they may have even been live. And the law enforcement that was in the gallery didn't see the individual. I had to get the attention of law enforcement and ask them to remove the person and then confiscate their cell phone. But the witness who was on the stand testifying then testified with their head down. They didn't even want their face to be seen. We almost missed the opportunity to extract that testimony from that victim.
So a lot of the recommendations, it sounds like, that we're trying to steer people toward is having criminal legal professionals review their practices, policies, and training regarding their response to these types of incidents and how they interact with victims and witnesses. And one thing that came up in the professional interviews is they recognize the importance of that initial interaction with a victim and witness in terms of their likelihood to remain engaged with the criminal legal process or their likelihood to provide information at all. And one of the things that we heard from victims and witnesses that they were really looking for in those initial interactions were a show of concern or empathy. I think a quote was, "A little empathy could go a long way." This idea of needing to build rapport. And so some of our criminal legal system professionals talked about some strategies or techniques that they use to build rapport with victims and witnesses. So they talked about, establishing common ground through just chit chat or small talk before really diving into the meat of the investigation, finding common interest or things that they could relate about. And then we heard a lot from the criminal legal system professionals about the need to make sure that if they have someone there who's providing resources, such as a victim advocate, to make sure that there's alignment between that professional and what they can offer and their skill set and themselves as a human being to use what a victim that I was speaking with termed as their ability to vibe with that victim or witness that they're working with. At each point of engagement, it's really important, each point of engagement that the criminal legal system has with victims or witnesses, because if there is one bad interaction, that could lead the victim or witness away from participation in the criminal legal system process altogether. But also recognizing that that first interaction is sometimes key in establishing that initial point of trust and the willingness of that individual to then have a trusted criminal legal system actor that can vouch for what the system is going to do, can be that point of contact to vouch for others who may be asked to come in and speak with that victim or witness or to help with that victim or witness, and recognizing that there are certain strategies or ways to approach the situation that are so important. And so all of this kind of points to looking and reviewing practices, looking and reviewing trainings that are offered. So I wondered if you all heard anything from either your victims or witnesses or professionals that you spoke with that kind of spoke to this need to really take an intentional look at current practices in order to figure out what can be done differently or a little better sometimes to help increase victim and witness participation throughout the process.
We certainly heard similar things from our victims. And, one of the things that I think really stood out to me is that sometimes, in addition to all the things that you're describing, Stacy, as far as just like, kind of having that humanity, sometimes people who are victims or witnesses, they just need a little bit of time. I think a lot of times, which, of course, there's benefits to law enforcement showing up right away. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that. But I don't think that they should necessarily expect for there to be cooperation on that first time, right? Sometimes people, they express this to us like, you're in a state of shock. You might have just been shot, or we had people who were held hostage or hit with guns. Right? They're in a state of shock when law enforcement or detectives show up, and it takes some time to kind of start to process, and then maybe at that point, once they've come out of that initial fight or flight mode, they might be more willing to even be able to have somebody develop rapport with them. But I also think it's important to mention here, and this is something that we heard from people we spoke with, is that there is the possibility that this is not going to be able to really be addressed on the law enforcement side entirely, right? I think law enforcement should do whatever they can to improve how they're interacting with people, to kind of show up with that more human decency, to learn different skills and techniques to build rapport. But I think you're really going to have change come from people like Pastor Clay, organizations like the one Pastor Clay works for, organizations like Cure Violence, these organizations that have people that are deeply embedded in these communities, that have lived experience, that can kind of really connect with these individuals. I think it's might be a tall ask to think that, law enforcement, at least anytime soon, is going to be able to get over these massive barriers of mistrust. But in the interim, you have these community-based organizations that are doing this work, have been doing this work, are there in these people's lives every day. I think of another organization, Yeah Philly, that they are doing this amazing work with individuals that are really helping to change lives and build trust. And then maybe, like Pastor Clay has mentioned that he does, maybe they can kind of act as this bridge between the two. So I think that's, really important, of just also questioning how much we can really expect from law enforcement to bridge these gaps.
And just quickly, I'll add in terms of helping law enforcement to be a bit more personable. It makes a difference. The first contact. We know from a research standpoint that the first police officer on scene is key to the resolution of the crime. That first police officer is key in preserving the crime scene, in preserving those witnesses. And then if there's a victim, getting help for the victim. So if that is true in the actual incident, then when we're following up with detectives coming to the emergency room, to your point, Stacy, that first interaction is everything. And I'm always interested in assessing where's the frustration, where's the misalignment, as you pointed out, Stacy. And Jesse, your point is well taken, that the victim, the family of the victim, has just been traumatized. They're just trying to survive the moment. So how much can we really expect in that emergency room where someone's been shot and there are two detectives who are asking them what happened? And we have to have that contact. It does have to happen then. But therein, I think, is the critical point where we need the follow up, where the victim is now, sort of back to baseline. They're in a safe setting. And now we've got law enforcement, we've got detectives who get it and understand that this second contact, the second contact might be the key to getting resolution in the matter. Individuals were willing to come and be interviewed about perhaps the worst day of their life because of a relationship and the trust that has been built up. And Jesse did not botch the opportunity by his interaction and how he is very warm, very direct. Jesse, you had questions that you were going to ask, but the tone, your follow-up, Stacy, your ability to hear what we're saying and then have a follow-up that pulls more out of us, I think is invaluable. And if we could overlay that, the law enforcement criminal justice, sensitivity, and then the opportunity to see community organizations form the bridge, kind of act as a liaison, as a support. I think we'll see better outcomes.
Something that we heard from a lot of people as well is a lot of people might have been willing to provide certain information to law enforcement. Now, that doesn't mean that they would be willing to get on a stand and, testify, but they might be willing to say, hey, look, there's this ring camera on the house over there. There's the bodega on the corner. They have a camera, right? Or, so they're willing to kind of give these leads to point officers in the right direction without having to act as that star witness in the situation. And for these individuals, they're not being uncooperative. They're not trying to stymie law enforcement, but they're trying to give what they can give. And so I think taking an appreciation of that as well and seeing that these are individuals who are trying to help in the best way that they can, I think can also go a really long way in those interactions.
That's a great point, and it reminds me of an interview with a witness in North Carolina, and she talked about she had certain officers whom she trusted to share information with. And the reason why they were trusted is because of her experience interacting with them. She had her own history of criminal involvement, but still had very positive relationships with these particular officers. And they even had this sort of informal agreement where the officers understood that she may provide them information, but they were not going to put her name on paperwork. So in that case, she was participating, she was providing information, but she was doing so within a very special, trusted context in which she knew that her identity would remain anonymous, which is something that a lot of victims and witnesses said has to happen. And then I wanted to follow up on your point about the importance of the partnership in this project. So in North Carolina, we partnered with Reverend Jim Summey to help us with recruitment. He is a former executive director of the High Point Community Against Violence. And he's spent his entire career not only in working as a pastor, but also helping individuals who have been justice involved and have violent criminal histories get access to resources, training, and things to help them get on a better path in life. And so through his partnership and his ability to help connect us with participants for this project, it made it successful. But I can also think of several interviewees who mentioned that it was him specifically that helped them navigate through this process. So a very quick example, one individual, he had experienced a very severe physical assault. He was shot, I think, by 3 or 4 different people. He was hospitalized, and then he himself was later arrested. So the first thing on his mind was retaliation. And he was dead set on going back and retaliating against these individuals whom he knew that were involved in that very serious physical assault on him. However, in meeting Jim, who he happened to be connected with through a bail bondsman, Jim was able to talk to him about his thoughts and allowed him time to slow down and think about, is retaliation the right thing to do? What are the consequences of that? Where is that going to get me in the grand scheme of things? And for him, it was just having that listening ear, that trusted person to talk to, that really made an impact, at least in preventing his following through on the retaliation against the perpetrators in his incident. So with that being said, Pastor Clay, I wanted to kick it back over to you because you are involved in this work and interacting with victims and witnesses on a regular basis. So, we know that a large number of people, they've experienced community violence. They may have never spoken about it. They're carrying around trauma from these incidents. And again, it's more than one incident that people have experienced. Some aren't reporting to law enforcement. So even if there are system advocates, victims and witnesses who aren't reporting to law enforcement won't have access to them. So talk to us about what you've seen in your work or your own experiences about how community service providers can build bridges to law enforcement and the role that credible messengers can take in kind of building these bridges and helping with improving victim and witness participation moving forward.
It's imperative that we have partnerships with the entirety of the system. And part of brokering a different response is the idea that we can get resolution the legal way. That we do have this criminal justice system, that we do have a legal way that keeps you from becoming the victimizer now. And so that trust factor is key. And the organization that I work for, this is the work that we're doing. Boots on the ground, one-on-one, up close and personal, and kind of looked upon as a credible messenger. We are actually seeing some movement in the criminal justice system on the law enforcement side with their willingness to partner with us in the community and actually see greater resolution. We're seeing some real success. And that trust factor, I think, is key.
Jesse, do you have any final thoughts before we conclude?
Well, just want to thank you again for having us on. And, I think, one of the things I'll say to close out is, even though we've seen some pretty significant reductions in violence over the last few years, the reality is that for certain communities, for certain areas of our city, certain areas of I'm sure North Carolina and cities all across the country, this violence, gun violence, community violence is still a daily reality. And so, I just cannot overstate the importance of these community-based programs for people like Pastor Clay, for these organizations that are, as Pastor Clay mentioned, have boots on the ground. This is not a time to get comfortable or a time to celebrate. This is, a time to keep the foot on the gas, as they say, and, continue to support these organizations and continue to invest in these communities so that people can have a reality that isn't plagued by violence every day. It's as important as it was during the pandemic and will continue to be so for the foreseeable future.
Thank you for that, Jesse. I think that's the perfect period or exclamation point to end our podcast. So, Jesse and Pastor Clay, again, thank you for your time today discussing victim and witness intimidation. It's been a pleasure talking with you all and working with you all. And I can't wait to see what we can do in terms of recommendations and what can be done with this research moving forward.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like and follow Just Science on your platform of choice. For more information on today's topic, visit our project's impact page linked in the podcast description. Again, I'm your host, Stacy Sechrist, and this has been another episode of Just Science.
Tune in to upcoming special release episodes and seasons. Opinions or points of views expressed in this podcast represent a consensus of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of its funding.